The old man at the back of the room didn't move when he saw the photograph. Everyone else was talking, shaking hands, holding paper plates of food. He just stood there with a glass of water in his hand and stared at the framed photo on the table like it had said something to him. I noticed because I was the one who put that photo there. It was a small picture, taken sometime in the early 1970s. My grandfather in a flight suit, standing in front of something that had been blurred out, the background gone grey like someone had taken an eraser to it. I'd found it tucked inside an old Bible in the back of his closet, and I'd brought it to the memorial because it was the only one I had where he looked young and certain about something. The old man finally looked up and found me across the room. He didn't smile. He just said quietly, like he already knew who I was, "Where did you get that?" I told him it was my grandfather's, that he'd passed 6 weeks ago. The man set his water glass down on the nearest table. "We need to talk," he said. "Not here." That was how I found out that the man I had spent my childhood being embarrassed by was not in any way the man I thought he was. My grandfather lived in a small ranch house in rural Tennessee, about 40 minutes outside of Knoxville. The kind of town where the Dollar General is the nicest building on Main Street and people wave at cars they don't recognize just out of habit. He'd lived there since before I was born, in the same house with the same cracked linoleum in the kitchen and the same squeaky third porch step that he never fixed, even when I offered to fix it for him. He wasn't flashy. He drove a 2003 Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror and a bumper sticker that said simply "Veteran." He didn't hunt or fish or go to church, which put him slightly outside of the local social order. He read a lot. He watched old westerns. He made terrible coffee and drank it anyway. My mother, his daughter, had a complicated relationship with him that I spent most of my childhood not fully understanding. She would describe him as difficult, withdrawn, emotionally unavailable. She would say he was the kind of man who showed up when it was convenient and disappeared when it wasn't. She would tell these stories with a particular flatness in her voice, the kind that meant the wound was old and she had stopped expecting it to close. My father was worse. My father thought my grandfather was a failure, a man who had served his country in some vague capacity decades ago and had nothing to show for it. No money, no accomplishments, no standing, no house worth inheriting, no connections worth cultivating. My father was an operations manager at a logistics company, and he measured people the way you measure inventory. My grandfather came up short on every metric that mattered to him. So we didn't see him much. Holidays sometimes, a birthday here and there. My parents would sit through dinner and find reasons to leave early. My younger brother would vanish into his phone, and I would sit on the porch with my grandfather in the blue Tennessee evening and watch the fireflies come up out of the grass, and he would tell me small things about nothing. The names of birds, how to read weather in the sky, whether certain kinds of wood were good for burning or just good for looking at. He never talked about the military, not once. Not with me, not with my parents, not with anyone that I ever saw. If you brought it up, he would go quiet in a polite way that meant the conversation was over. I assumed, growing up, that this was because there was nothing to say. My parents had built a picture of him as a man who had coasted through his service doing something unremarkable and had come home with nothing to show for it except a bumper sticker and a pension that barely covered his property taxes. I was 29 years old and stationed at Fort Campbell with the army when my aunt called me. Not my mother, my aunt, my grandfather's neighbor's daughter, who had his emergency contact number because nobody in our family had thought to give him a better option. He had fallen down the back steps. He had lain on the ground for almost 2 hours before a passing teenager heard him. By the time the ambulance came, his hip was fractured and he was dehydrated and running a fever. He was at the hospital in Knoxville, and he had been there for 18 hours, and no one from the family had come. I put in for emergency leave that night. When I got to the hospital, he was in a shared room, propped up at an angle with an IV in his arm and the news on a television mounted near the ceiling. He looked smaller than I remembered. There was something about seeing him without the porch, without the house around him, That made him seem fragile in a way I hadn't prepared myself for. He turned when he heard me come in and his face did something complicated that he smoothed over quickly. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "I told him I wanted to. I told him Mom and Dad would be here soon." He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked back at the television. "No, they won't," he said. Not angry, just quiet and certain, like a man stating the weather. He was right. My mother called that evening with an excuse about work. My father texted. My brother didn't respond at all. My grandfather spent 11 days in the hospital and then 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility, and I was there for the first 5 days before my leave ran out. In that time, he said very little about himself. We talked about my work, about what I was doing at Fort Campbell, about a book he'd been reading. We watched old westerns together in his hospital room, and he fell asleep during most of them and woke up having missed nothing. On the last day before I left, he held my hand for a moment when I said goodbye. He wasn't a demonstrative man. It surprised me. "You turned out well," he said, like he'd been worrying about it for a long time and had finally arrived at a verdict. I drove back to base and told myself he would be fine, that he was tough, that people like him always managed. He died 4 months later. Not from the fall. His hip healed well enough. He died from pneumonia, alone in the house because he hadn't wanted to bother anyone. The woman from the property management company found him when he missed a call about his lease renewal. My mother called me to tell me. She cried a little, briefly, and then her voice settled into something practical. "There's going to be paperwork," she said, "and someone needs to deal with the house." That someone was me. I arranged a funeral myself. Small ceremony, graveside service, a Tuesday afternoon in October with grey clouds and the smell of wood smoke in the air. The minister from the closest church, a neighbor who had known him for 30 years, 2 men from the local VFW post who had heard he was a veteran and came out of respect for the title even though they didn't know him. My parents came. My father wore a suit that looked like he'd worn it to a business lunch. My mother cried in the car on the way there. I found out later, and then composed herself before getting out. My brother took the day off work and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the middle distance. Nobody spoke very much. Afterward, I went back to his house and started going through his things. It was the kind of work that feels disrespectful in the beginning and then becomes something else. I found what I expected. Old clothes, tools, a VHS tapes of westerns, a collection of paperback novels organized by some system I couldn't figure out. The refrigerator had a half-empty jar of peanut butter in it and not much else. In his bedroom closet, on the top shelf behind a shoebox of old receipts, I found a folded manila envelope. Inside was the photograph, a man in a flight suit. The blurred background, his face younger by 40 years, but unmistakably him, in the same way that certain expressions don't age. There was also, in the envelope, a challenge coin. Heavy, brass-colored, slightly worn, no unit name on it, no motto, just a symbol I didn't recognize. An angular mark, precise and deliberate, that looked less like decoration and more like a key. I kept both. My parents didn't ask what I'd found. They were focused on the property. My father had already been in contact with a real estate agent by the time I left the house that day. I went back to base carrying the photograph and the coin, and a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. 3 weeks later, I was at a Veterans Memorial event at the post, the kind of thing you attend in dress uniform and shake hands at and listen to speeches about duty and sacrifice. I'd been to 100 of them. They had a way of blurring together after a while. I had the challenge coin in my jacket pocket. I'd been carrying it since I found it, the way you carry something you haven't figured out yet, something about the weight of it. There was a reception afterward in a large hall. I was standing near the back, holding a glass of water, when an older man stopped walking. He wasn't in uniform. Civilian clothes, good posture, grey hair cut short. He looked to be in his mid-70s. And he was staring at something near my hand. I looked down. The coin had come partially out of my pocket, the way things do when you stand for too long in dress clothes. The man looked up at me. His face had gone very still. "Where did you get that?" he said. I told him it had been my grandfather's, that he had passed recently. Something moved through the man's expression that I couldn't read. He asked me my grandfather's name. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to come with me." He led me to a side room off the main hall. 2 chairs, a table, a window looking out at a parking lot. He closed the door and we sat across from each other, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Your grandfather served in a unit that doesn't appear in official Air Force records," he said. "That coin is a verification marker. It was used internally to identify personnel cleared for operations that were conducted under full deniability." I asked him what that meant. "It means," he said carefully, "that if the missions succeeded, they didn't happen. And if they failed, they also didn't happen." I thought about the blurred background in the photograph. He was an intelligence operative. He was a reconnaissance specialist, the man said. He flew missions along the Chinese border and into Southeast Asia during a period when we were officially not flying missions there. The photographic intelligence he gathered directly informed decisions that saved American lives. His name does not appear in any publicly available record. I sat with that for a moment. "My family thought he was nobody," I said. "My parents, they thought he was just some guy who had served in some minor capacity and couldn't let go of it." The man nodded. He had the measured expression of someone who had heard versions of this before. "That is the ordinary cost of that kind of service," he said. "The secrecy doesn't end when the mission ends. It follows you home." He told me his name, retired Air Force, a former senior intelligence officer, someone who had worked in the same operational theater a decade after my grandfather. He had known of my grandfather by reputation, not personally. They had never met. But the work had been known, in the way that certain work is known only to the people who understand what it cost. "The coin," I said. "Why did he keep it?" The man glanced at it. "Because it was the only proof that he existed," he said, "in any official sense." I thought about how my grandfather had never talked about his service, how my parents had read that silence as failure, how I had too sometimes. I thanked the man for telling me. He gave me a card with only a phone number on it and told me to call if I had questions. On the drive back to post, I pulled over once, on a county road with nothing on either side of it except winter fields, and sat there for a few minutes. The coin was in my hand. The symbol on it had caught some light from a passing truck, and it looked, for a moment, very deliberate, very purposeful, not decorative at all. I didn't tell my parents right away. I needed to understand it myself first. I called a retired Army intelligence officer I knew from a joint training exercise 2 years earlier, a woman who had spent 30 years in places she couldn't name. I described the coin to her. There was a pause. "I've seen something like that described once," she said. In a debrief from the late 80s, someone had run into a former operator who still had one. I asked what it meant. "It means the person holding it was read into programs that were never formally acknowledged," she said. "Not black budget in the way people use that phrase now. More like those programs structurally could not be claimed. There was no mechanism for acknowledgement. Not then, maybe not ever." "So what happens to those people?" "They go home," she said, "and they live their lives, and nobody knows." That night, I went through everything I'd taken from the house again. There was one more thing I hadn't fully processed. A small notebook I'd found tucked under the liner of a dresser drawer. I thought it was just numbers at the time. Dates and numbers and occasional geographic coordinates that meant nothing to me. Looking at it now, with what I knew, it looked different. The coordinates were locations in Southeast Asia. The dates spanned almost a decade. And in the margins, appearing in random places throughout, was the same symbol that was on the coin. He had kept records of things that officially hadn't happened. I made copies of everything. I drove to my parents' house on a Saturday in November. It was the kind of cold Tennessee afternoon where everything looks a little gray and the leaves are all down and the sky sits low over everything. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was watching football. My brother had come over for reasons I didn't ask about and was in the living room with his phone. I sat down at the kitchen table and I put the photograph and the coin and the notebook in front of them. My father picked up the photograph first. He looked at it for a moment. "This is from his Air Force days," he said. Not a question. He sounded already prepared to dismiss it. "He wasn't in the regular Air Force," I said. "He flew reconnaissance missions along the Chinese border and into Southeast Asia. Classified operations. Missions that officially didn't happen. That coin is a verification marker for personnel cleared into those programs. A retired senior intelligence officer confirmed it to me directly." My mother sat down. She looked at the photograph more carefully. "He never said anything," she said. "He couldn't," I said. "That was the deal." "But he could have told us something," she said. "He could have said, I don't know, that there were things he couldn't talk about." "Would you have believed him?" I asked. She was quiet. My father had picked up the notebook. He was looking at the pages with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something complicated was happening in his face that he wasn't managing as well as usual. "I threw one of these out," he said. "When we were clearing the house, there were two of them." I felt the loss of that, sharp and sudden. "You thought it was nothing," I said. "I thought—" He stopped. He turned a page, turned it back. "I thought he was a man who couldn't stop performing the role that nobody wanted him to play anymore." His voice had changed. "I thought it was the stubborn old man version of not being able to grow up." My brother, from the doorway where he'd been standing for the last few minutes, he asked me to come visit him once, last spring. I said I was too busy. Nobody said anything. "He fixed bikes for kids in the neighborhood," I said. "Did you know that? The woman at the property office told me. She said he'd been doing it for years. Kids would bring him busted bikes from the whole street and he'd fix them for free and not tell anyone." My mother covered her mouth. "He never told anyone," I said. "Not about the bikes, not about the missions, not about any of it. That was just who he was." My father set the notebook down on the table. His hands were not entirely steady. "We failed him," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't dramatic. It was just a flat statement of a thing that had become true. I didn't tell him he was wrong. In the spring, my parents asked if we could hold a second service. A real one, not another formal funeral, just something that acknowledged who he actually was. We held it at the VFW post in his town. The two men who had come to the first service helped organize it. A handful of people from the neighborhood came, the woman from the property office, an older man who had lived down the road for 40 years and had stories about my grandfather that none of us had ever heard, about the time he helped a family clear their flooded basement, about how he'd driven someone to chemotherapy appointments for months without mentioning it to anyone. The retired intelligence officer came. He sat near the back and didn't speak. When I caught his eye, he nodded once. Nobody gave a formal eulogy. We just talked about him. My father stood up at one point unexpectedly and said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "I spent my whole life measuring what people showed me. I missed everything he was because he never put it on display." My mother cried. My brother was quiet the way people get quiet when they've run out of ways to pretend something isn't hitting them hard. I stood outside afterward with the coin in my hand. The day was cold, but the sun was out and the light was very clear, the way early spring sometimes is in Tennessee, like everything has been rinsed clean. I thought about all the things he had known and never said, the missions that never happened, the lies that continued somewhere because of work that had no name attached to it, all the quiet mornings he had spent in a small house, fixing bikes and watching westerns and drinking terrible coffee, carrying decades of things he was not allowed to explain. I had thought, my whole life, that strength meant being visible. It was something my parents had taught me without meaning to, that what you couldn't display didn't count, that invisible accomplishments were a kind of failure. He had known something different, had lived something different, and I had been too young and too much my parents' daughter to see it. My family changed after that. Not all at once, not in any keen or dramatic way. These things don't happen like they do in movies. My father started volunteering at the VFW post on Saturday mornings. He didn't tell us for 3 weeks. When I found out, he seemed almost embarrassed about it, which was new for him. He said the men there told him things that made him feel like he'd been looking at the world through the wrong end of a telescope. My mother went back to her father's neighborhood and knocked on the door of the woman who had called the ambulance the day of his fall. She brought flowers. She apologized. The woman told her about all the small things my grandfather had done over the years: the bikes, the rides, a running account at the local diner that he'd quietly contributed to so that certain people could always get a meal. My brother called me one night around midnight from a parking lot. He didn't really have a reason. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. At the end, he said, "I think I've been measuring the wrong things too." I didn't say anything. I just listened. I still have the coin. I carry it in my left jacket pocket, and sometimes I take it out and hold it the way you hold something that is teaching you something you haven't finished learning yet. I know what the symbol means now, or as much as can be known about it. Proof, as a retired officer told me, for a man who was no longer supposed to be provable. But to me, it means something simpler. It means he knew who he was. Through every holiday we missed, every call we didn't make, every time my family's indifference came down on him like weather, he knew who he was. He never needed us to see him. I wish we had anyway. The last time I was in Tennessee, I drove out to the cemetery alone. It was late afternoon, the sky going gold and orange behind the tree line. His headstone is simple: his name, his years, and the word father, which my mother chose and which I think was her way of trying to say something without knowing how. I stood there for a while, told him about my work, about my brother's new job, about my father learning the names of the regulars at the VFW post. I didn't put the coin down. He'd given it to me without giving it to me, and I wasn't ready to give it back. But I sat down in the cold grass and stayed longer than I'd planned, the way you stay when you're with someone you should have spent more time with when you had the chance. The light kept changing, the trees went quiet. There are people in the world who do the most important things and leave no record of it, who live and die without anyone seeing what they carried. And so often the people closest to them never think to look, because quiet has always been mistaken by people who love noise for having nothing to say. If you've ever had someone like that in your life, someone who helped without announcing it, who served without asking to be seen, who carried something heavy in silence for so long that it looked like nothing at all, I hope you still have time to ask them about it. And if you don't have time anymore, I hope you'll carry what they left behind with the same care they carried it. That's what I'm trying to do anyway. I keep the coin in my left jacket pocket. Not because I'm holding on to a secret, but because I'm holding on to a standard, one that my grandfather lived by every single day without ever once announcing it. For most of my life, I thought strength was something you showed. My parents raised me in a house where achievement was measured by what could be framed, posted, referenced at dinner: a promotion, a title, a number in a bank account. My grandfather didn't have any of those things, and so I quietly filed him under lesser than, under didn't try hard enough. That was the story I inherited without questioning it. What I've understood since, and what I think about every time I turn that coin over in my hand, is that we confused silence for emptiness. And those are not the same thing at all. My grandfather flew missions that no record will ever confirm. He came home and fixed broken bikes for neighborhood kids and drove people to doctor's appointments and kept a tab at a local diner, so certain people could always get a meal. He never mentioned any of it. Not to us, not to anyone. He just did it, the same way he carried everything else, quietly, completely, without waiting for someone to notice. That is not a failure of communication. That is a form of character so disciplined it can look from the outside like nothing at all. I think about my father standing at that second service saying he spent his whole life measuring what people showed him. I think about my mother knocking on a neighbor's door with flowers, apologizing for years of not checking in. These are not comfortable things to witness in your parents, but they happened because something in them shifted, because cause finally met consequence in a way they couldn't reroute around. We ignored a man who was doing quiet, essential, meaningful work his entire life. And we lost him without ever knowing him. That is the cost. It is a fair and honest cost, and the only thing you can do with it is decide to pay attention differently going forward. That's the part that stays with me. Not the classified operations, not the coin, not even the retired officer confirming what my grandfather had been. What stays with me is simpler than that. It's the understanding that good judgment, real judgment, the kind that matters, requires you to look past the surface of people, to notice the ones who don't demand your attention, to ask questions before it's too late to ask them. My grandfather had that quality his entire life. He read situations clearly, and he responded to what was actually there, not to what was convenient for him to see. He made hard choices over and over again, and he kept making them without recognition, without reward, without anyone in his own family understanding the weight of what he carried. That kind of endurance isn't luck and it isn't personality. It's something you build slowly by deciding what you stand for and then standing for it when it costs you something. I'm still learning how to do that. I think I'd be learning it for a long time. But I carry the coin and I carry what it means, and on the days when it's easier to take the louder, simpler path, I take it out and I hold it for a moment. And then I try to do the thing that doesn't need an audience.